Millionaire crashes, wedding to kidnap the bride. The shocking truth he uncovers will leave you speechless. Hook. The church bells rang, echoing across the crisp, cold air. The crowd murmured in excitement. The bride stood at the altar, radiant in her ivory gown. Her smile, bright but tight, didn't reach her eyes. The groom, handsome in his tailored suit, held her hands. They exchanged vows, their voices soft and trembling. But then, the door slammed open. A tall man, dressed in a black coat, stormed in. The room fell silent. Everyone turned, staring. His eyes were fixed on the bride. "Stop the wedding!" he shouted, his voice low and commanding. A gasp rippled through the congregation. The groom stiffened, confusion clouding his face. The man stepped forward, eyes burning with intensity. "Who is this?" someone whispered. The man didn't answer. He just looked at the bride. She paled. Her hands trembled, slipping from her groom's grasp. "Come with me," the man said, his voice softer now, yet still urgent. The bride's lips parted. Her breath caught in her throat. No one moved. The tension in the room thickened, suffocating. "I'm not letting you marry him," the man continued, his voice cold, steely. The bride looked at him, her eyes wide. Tears welled up, but she didn't speak. Her heart raced. What was happening? She wanted to run, but her legs wouldn't move. The man reached out. He took her arm. She recoiled, startled. "You don't know the truth," he whispered. The crowd waited, holding its breath. The groom's face was red now, fists clenched. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his voice shaking with anger. The man ignored him, pulling the bride gently towards the door. She resisted barely, as if torn between loyalty and fear. The air felt heavy, suffocating. She caught a glimpse of the groom's furious face, but something in the stranger's eyes, something familiar. "Come," the man urged again. The bride's mind raced. Who was he? Why was he doing this? She tried to speak, but her voice failed her. Her pulse thudded in her ears. What was the truth he spoke of? "Please," she whispered, almost pleading. The man's eyes softened for a fraction of a second. "Trust me," he said, guiding her toward the door. The crowd watched, frozen, in disbelief. The man's grip tightened, and they stepped out into the night. The cold air hit her like a slap, sharp and biting. She shivered, her mind a whirl of confusion. The man's hand was still on her arm, firm but not violent. They didn't speak as they hurried down the church steps, past the rows of astonished onlookers. The bride's heart pounded in her chest. Her breath came in shallow gasps. Every step felt heavier. Her eyes flickered back to the church, to the groom who was now at the doorway, staring in disbelief. But she couldn't look back. Not now. They reached a sleek, black car parked at the curb. The man opened the door without a word. He motioned for her to get inside. With a hesitant glance, she slid into the car. The door slammed shut behind her. The car's engine roared to life. The man sat beside her, his eyes fixed forward, his jaw set. For a moment, there was silence. Then he spoke, his voice low, almost grim. "You don't remember me, do you?" he asked. Her throat tightened. She shook her head, unsure of what to say. "No," she whispered. "I don't." The man's eyes darkened. "I'm your father," he said, his words slicing through the silence. Her breath hitched. "Father?" She turned to face him, her mind racing. "You..." Her voice faltered. "But how? Why didn't you?" He cut her off with a sharp wave of his hand. "It's a long story, one you're not ready to hear." The words echoed in her mind. Her father? How could this be? She had been told her father had died when she was just a child. But here he was, alive, sitting next to her. The silence between them was suffocating. Her heart pounded louder. The car sped through the dark streets, the city lights flashing by. Where was he taking her? Why now? She needed answers, but the questions swirled unanswered. Why did you stop my wedding? She asked finally, her voice shaky. He turned to look at her, his eyes hard. Because I had no choice, he said, his words heavy with meaning. You were about to make the biggest mistake of your life. Her mind raced. What did he mean? What mistake? But before she could ask, he spoke again. You don't know who you're marrying, he said, his tone darkening. The tension in the car thickened. Her stomach twisted. She could barely breathe. What are you talking about? She managed to choke out. He didn't answer right away. He simply stared ahead, the weight of his words hanging in the air. He's not who you think he is, he said finally. Her pulse quickened. Who is he talking about? The groom? Her mind spun, but the answers didn't come. What do you mean? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her father leaned in, his eyes cold. He's dangerous. The word hung in the air like a poison. Dangerous? She whispered, barely able to comprehend. Her father nodded slowly, his expression unwavering. More than you could ever imagine, he muttered. Her head spun, the world around her spinning faster than she could catch up. How? Her voice trembled. He's not who he says he is, he repeated. Her mind raced, but no clarity came. Then why did you let me? She couldn't finish the question. Her father's face darkened. Because I thought you were safe. But now, I see, I was wrong. She felt a chill creep down her spine, a deep, gnawing fear. Her gaze flickered to the window, the city lights flashing past in a blur. Her wedding, her life, felt like a distant memory now. Her father's presence beside her was a stark reminder of everything she hadn't known. Who is he really? She asked, her voice almost pleading. Her father's grip tightened on the seat. Your fiancé, he paused, his voice thick with disgust. He's been using you. Her heart lurched. Using me? She gasped. For what? Her throat went dry. Her father met her gaze, his eyes filled with a deep, painful truth. His family, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. They want your inheritance. She blinked, stunned. Inheritance? She had no idea what he was talking about. Her father let out a sigh, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Your family. We've been watching you, protecting you, he continued. The wealth. It's yours. But they want it. Her chest tightened. Why didn't you tell me? She whispered. He shook his head, his eyes dark and full of regret. I couldn't. You were too young. It was safer this way. She tried to process his words, but it felt like her whole world was crumbling. Who are they? She asked, her voice shaking. The man she thought she loved, was he a part of this? Her father didn't answer right away. He's not just a man. He's part of something much bigger, he said finally. An organization with ties that go beyond what you could ever imagine. The car swerved around a corner, her father's hand gripping the wheel tightly. The city lights outside seemed distant now, the shadows closing in on her. Everything she knew felt like a lie. Her heart raced, terror crawling under her skin. She opened her mouth to speak, but stopped. Her thoughts were too jumbled, too wild to make sense of. What do we do now? She asked, her voice small. Her father turned to her, his face unreadable. We find the truth, he said firmly, and we end this. Once and for all. The car sped through the dark streets, the hum of the engine filling the silence. Her heart pounded in her chest. She felt like a prisoner in her own life. Everything she thought she knew was crumbling around her. She glanced at her father, his jaw tight with determination. He wasn't the man she remembered. This man, sitting beside her, was a stranger with a dangerous truth. Her mind raced as she tried to piece together the fragments of what he had said. Her inheritance? An organization? Her fiancé? A pawn in a deadly game? Her stomach twisted with a mix of anger and fear. How did you even find me? she asked suddenly, her voice low. Her father's lips pressed into a thin line. I've always been watching, he said, his voice grim. But you, he paused, taking a deep breath. You were hidden well. You had no idea. She turned her gaze to the dark road ahead, the trees blurred by, shadows stretching like ghosts. I don't understand, she whispered. Why didn't you come sooner? Her father's face hardened. I couldn't. I was trying to protect you. I had to keep you away from it all. The car swerved again, his grip tightening on the wheel. The tension in the car was suffocating. She wanted to ask more, but the words didn't come. Her mind was tangled in confusion and fear. The night outside seemed darker now, as if the world had shifted into a place of shadows and lies. Her father was no longer the man she had known, the man who had left her, the man who had kept secrets. And now she was tangled in his web. What happens now? She asked, her voice barely audible. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced at her, his expression cold, calculating. We find him, he said, his voice low, dangerous. And we end this no matter the cost. The words sent a chill through her spine. End it? She echoed, her voice trembling. Yes, he said, his eyes narrowing. You're in danger. We have to stop him before it's too late. The weight of his words pressed down on her like a physical force. She stared at him, trying to understand. Who was he talking about? Her fiancé? Or someone else? The car screeched to a halt. Her father quickly shifted into park and turned to face her. We're here, he said, his voice sharp. Get ready. Her heart skipped a beat. Where are we? She asked, her voice shaking. Her father didn't answer. He simply opened. The building loomed in the shadows, its broken windows like hollow eyes staring into the night. Her father walked toward the entrance, his pace deliberate, almost urgent. She hesitated for a moment, her feet glued to the ground. Something about this place felt wrong. Her pulse raced in her throat. Come on, her father called, glancing back at her. She took a breath and followed him, every step feeling heavier than the last. The air was thick with tension, the silence almost suffocating. Her feet crunched on the gravel as they approached the door, which hung slightly ajar. Her father didn't knock or announce their presence. He simply pushed it open with a creak that sent a jolt of fear through her. Inside, the smell of dampness and decay filled her nose. The floorboards groaned beneath her weight, the sound unsettling in the stillness. She could barely make out shapes in the dark, the faint outlines of old furniture, forgotten relics of a time long past. Her father led the way, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. She didn't know where they were or what was waiting inside, but something deep within her whispered that this was the beginning of the end. As they moved deeper into the building, a faint light appeared ahead, flickering weakly from beneath a door at the far end of the hallway. Her father's pace quickened. Stay close, he muttered, his voice low, but filled with urgency. She obeyed, her breath shallow as they reached the door. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat a drum of dread. Her father didn't knock. He simply opened it. Inside, a dimly lit room unfolded before her eyes. A man stood by the window, his back to them, staring out into the night. Her father stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension. It's time, he said. The man at the window turned slowly, his eyes locking onto hers. Her breath caught in her throat. It was him, the man she had been about to marry. But he wasn't the man she thought he was. His smile was cold, predatory, and his eyes, she could see it now, the deceit, the darkness. You, she whispered, barely able to speak. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped toward her, his gaze never leaving her face. I knew you'd find out eventually, he said, his voice smooth, almost mocking. Her father's jaw tightened. We're done playing games, he growled. The man chuckled, as if this was all some sick joke. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, his smile widening. "I was never after your money." Her stomach dropped. What was he saying? Her father's eyes flickered to her, a warning in them. "No," the man continued, his voice taking on a darker edge. "I was after you." Her blood ran cold. "After me?" she echoed, her voice shaking. He took a step closer, his presence overwhelming. "Yes," he said, his grin widening. "Because you're the key." "The key? To what?" Her mind raced, but the answers didn't come. The man stepped closer still, until there was almost no space between them. Her father moved, stepping between them. "Stay away from her," he growled, his fists clenched. The man laughed softly, a dark, almost mocking sound. "You think you can stop me?" he sneered. Her father didn't respond. Instead, he pulled something from his jacket, a small, silver device that caught the dim light of the room. The man's expression faltered, just for a second, and in that brief moment of hesitation, her father lunged forward, the device held out in front of him. "No!" the man shouted, his eyes wide with panic. But it was too late. The air crackled with energy, the room filled with a strange, humming sound. The man staggered back, his eyes widening in disbelief. You've been planning this all along," he gasped. Her father didn't say a word. He just watched as the man's expression shifted from anger to fear. And in that moment, she finally understood. Her father had been playing a game of his own all along. The room was heavy with the electric hum of tension. The man stumbled backward, his eyes wide, filled with shock. Her father stood motionless, the silver device still in his hand, its glowing light casting eerie shadows on the walls. For a long moment, no one spoke. The man's breath came in ragged gasps, his face paling as he looked between her and her father. "What did you do?" he whispered, his voice filled with a mix of fear and disbelief. Her father didn't flinch. He didn't respond immediately, but his eyes were cold, calm. "Everything I needed to do," he said finally, his voice hard. Her heart pounded in her chest, the weight of the moment crashing down on her. She stood there, rooted to the spot, trying to make sense of the scene unfolding before her. Her fiancé, no, the man who had been playing the part, was now clearly terrified. And her father, he wasn't the man she thought he was. "Get away from him," her father ordered, his tone as sharp as a knife. The man hesitated, his eyes flickering between the device and her father's unyielding stance. He opened his mouth to protest, but the words caught in his throat. Suddenly, everything she had believed felt like a lie. Her life, her wedding, the man she thought she knew, it was all a carefully constructed illusion. She started, her voice breaking. "You were using me?" The man turned to her, his face twisted with a bitter smile. "Using you?" he echoed, as if the idea itself amused him. "You were never meant to be a bride," he sneered. "You were a means to an end." Her world crumbled. Her stomach churned with nausea. For the first time, she realized just how far the deception ran. Her father stepped forward then, positioning himself between them. "Enough games," he growled. "The plan ends here." The man glared at him, fists clenched, but he didn't move. Her father's gaze never wavered. "You should have never gotten involved with my daughter," he said, his voice low and dangerous. The man seemed to hesitate. Then, his face twisted into a scowl. "You can't protect her forever," he spat, turning on his heel and storming toward the door. Her father didn't move to stop him. Instead, he simply watched, his face unreadable. The man reached the door, pausing with his hand on the handle. "I'll be back," he said darkly. "This isn't over." The door slammed shut behind him. For a long time, there was nothing but the sound of her own breathing. Her father turned to her then, his expression softening for the first time. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low. She didn't know what to say. Her whole life had been a lie, and the man she thought she loved, he was just another part of the deception. She nodded slowly, though inside, she was anything but okay. What was she supposed to do now? Her father reached out, pulling her into a firm embrace. "We'll fix this," he said, his voice full of certainty. But inside, she wasn't sure there was anything left to fix. The pieces of her life had shattered, and she didn't know if they could ever be put back together. The silence in the room was deafening, heavy with the weight of what had just unfolded. Her father's arms were around her, comforting yet distant. The shock of everything that had happened washed over her in waves. Her life had been ripped apart piece by piece, and now, standing in this decaying building with her father, a man she barely recognized, she realized there was no going back. The man she had once trusted, the man she thought she would marry, was gone. His promises, his love, all part of a twisted game. But what was she supposed to do now? Her father pulled away slightly, looking down at her with a somber expression. "I know this isn't easy," he said quietly, "but I need you to understand. You're safe now. The lies are over." She nodded slowly, but her heart felt like a foreign object in her chest. Safe. How could she feel safe when everything she thought was real had been a lie? Her father seemed to sense the storm inside her, his gaze softening. "You don't have to make any decisions right now," he said. "Take your time. We'll figure it out together." The words were meant to comfort, but they felt hollow. She wasn't sure what there was to figure out anymore. Her past, her future, it all seemed like a blur, a shattered image that could never be pieced back together. The door creaked open again, and her father's body tensed instinctively. But it wasn't the man who had just left. It was someone else, an ally of her father's, a familiar face, someone she had seen before, though she couldn't quite place it. "I've taken care of it," the man said, his voice low. "It's over." Her father nodded, his gaze meeting hers. "The danger is gone," he reassured her. She didn't know what to feel. Relief, fear, confusion, all of it tangled together inside her, leaving her unsure of who she really was anymore. But as she looked at her father, this man who had stayed in the shadows, waiting for the right moment, she realized something. She wasn't alone, and maybe, just maybe, she could start over. Not today, not yet, but someday. Her father's hand rested gently on her shoulder, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe there was still a chance for her to rebuild her life. But for now, she just needed to breathe. And with a quiet nod, she followed her father out of the building, leaving behind the chaos, the lies, and the shadows of her past. The night was still and quiet as they walked into the unknown. But for the first time, it felt like the beginning of something new.